All right.
I thank you. Please be seated. We'll be on the record again in State versus Geyser, same case number and same appearances. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a good lunch. We're now back to hear evidence today, and I understand that Mr. Compton has an additional witness to call.
We do. Attorney Kukler will handle this witness, Your
All
Honor.
right.
It's Dr. Ted Berney.
Okay, Dr. Berney, you're here.
Yes,
Okay, if you'd come forward, please. State your full name and spell your last name.
Kent Manning Berney, B-E-R-N-E-Y.
All right, thank you. Then Attorney Kukler.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Berney. You were court appointed in this case to do what in particular?
I was court appointed to do a supplementary mental examination.
And do you do those on a regular basis?
Part of my responsibility in my practice, which is devoted to forensic evaluations for the court, is to do conditional release evaluations. Supplemental mental examinations are a very similar evaluation for the court, offering opinions about the most appropriate setting for an individual subsequent to being found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about your training and experience and employment history?
Yes. I received my bachelor's degree in psychology in 1970. I received my master's degree from Eastern Washington University in 1975 in clinical applied psychology. I received my PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1985 and became licensed to practice independently as a psychologist in the state of Wisconsin in 1986. My practice has been devoted since 1990 to forensic evaluations for the court. I've completed over 7,500 evaluations in court proceedings, including both criminal and civil matters. I was the director of psychological services at Winnebago Mental Health Institute, one of the two state psychiatric hospitals in Wisconsin from 1999 to 2010. My responsibilities at Winnebago, I was employed half-time. My responsibilities included supervising the 14 staff psychologists. Approximately half of those staff were forensic psychologists doing forensic work at Winnebago. While at Winnebago, I was the co-chairman of the ethics committee at the Institute, and I was also on the state ethics committee. At that time, the state had a ethics committee for the Department of Health Services, and I was a member of that committee. I was also appointed to the ethics committee in the Wisconsin Psychological Association, and this was a 6-year appointment. I was the chairman of the personal practice aspect of the ethics committee for 3 years. I am presently contracted by the Wisconsin Supreme Court of Bar Examiners to evaluate prospective attorneys for fitness for duty. I'm also contracted by the University of Wisconsin Psychiatric Department and Medical School for supervision of medical students and residents regarding forensic evaluations. I'm contracted by a number of county mental health agencies throughout the state, primarily for the purpose of completing civil evaluations related to civil commitments. I have a very small private practice where I continue to see people in individual psychotherapy.
Thank you. So you worked as a medical director at Winnebago,
Yes, I did.
and that's where Morgan is presently.
I'm sorry, I worked as the director of psychological services, psychology, not medical.
Director of Psychology at Winnebago. When you worked there, did you know Jessica Andrews?
Yes, Jessica Andrews became employed during my employment. She was a staff social worker. She has recently been promoted to one of the two forensic service coordinators, I believe her title is. So I've known Ms. Andrews for, she probably started there in the early 2000s.
Now, when you are asked to do a supplemental mental examination, what is that exactly? What are you supposed to do?
The purpose of a supplemental evaluation, mental examination, is to assist the court in the trier of facts decision-making regarding the most appropriate treatment opportunities or facility for an individual who has been found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect and is committed to the Department of Health Services.
Is the Department of Health Services then ultimately the agency that would, if a person was to be placed somewhere outside of the mental health institute, would they be the agency that would find the appropriate placement for a person?
The state does have the responsibility through the Department of Health Services to develop the facility and to develop a treatment plan that then is presented to the court for the court's approval.
So your appointment here was to decide whether Morgan needs inpatient care or something other than inpatient care?
My responsibility is to offer an opinion regarding what is the most appropriate and least restrictive care. And of course, the most restrictive is continued inpatient treatment in Winnebago in this case. And then less restrictive settings would include residential care, group homes, direct release to, in this case, her parental home. So there's a variety, essentially a hierarchy of possibilities for a less restrictive.
As you understand it, what's the statutory rationale as to what constitutes a need for inpatient treatment or inpatient care?
Statutorily, relative to the issue of conditional release, the statute indicates that in order to be considered for conditional release, a person would not present a substantial risk or probability of risk of harm to themselves, others, or property.
So then somebody would, if they have that risk, would need to remain in an institution, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. So is the placement for somebody who is deemed a risk at a mental hospital, is that considered a punishment?
Individuals who are found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect are in the mental health system. This is not punishment. The purpose of placement of individuals in the psychiatric setting is to essentially treat them and rehabilitate them, to address the issues of their psychiatric illness, which, having been found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, means that they were not either able to conform their conduct to the requirements of the law or appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct as a result of a mental illness. And consequently, the purpose of psychiatric care is to address the issues of the mental illness, to essentially assist individuals through the use of treatment to have their mental illness be in remission, essentially, or controlled, to subsequently reduce their threat of dangerousness.
So while Morgan's been at Winnebago, she's been receiving psychiatric care, is that right?
Yes, she has.
And the necessary treatment to address her mental illness.
That's correct.
Okay, so how, can you take us through what you've done on this particular case? And if you need, you have your report in front of you, if
I
you need to
do.
look at it? Okay.
Yes, I do.
And could you just take us through what you did to evaluate Morgan?
For the purpose of the case before the court today, I saw Morgan on 2 occasions for interviews. I saw her on October 20 of 2017 and on November 9th of 2017. I spent approximately a little over 3 hours in both of my evaluations of her. I utilized some psychological testing. I should note that I was also court-ordered previously in this matter to do an evaluation regarding her initial plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. And at that time, I had also used psychological testing, which I, again, offered in my report to the court in this matter as part of my review of records.
Can I stop you for 1 minute?
Sure.
When you were asked previously to do your NGI evaluation, what was your finding at that time?
My finding was that Morgan did meet the standard as not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect.
Okay, so you supported the plea.
I did, yes.
Okay, so go on about what you've done for this eval.
As I said, I used some psychological testing this time. Basically, the purpose of that is to attempt to recognize changes in her cognitive capacity, reasoning ability through the use of standardized testing. I reviewed all available records at Winnebago Mental Health Institute from the time of my evaluation for her plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, which occurred in November of 2016. So I reviewed all records from that time to the present time. As I indicated, I last saw Morgan on November 9. This week, I received records from Winnebago Mental Health Institute, which included all the records from November 9 to the present time. I also consulted with Ms. Andrews, and I recognize that Ms. Andrews did testify in this matter. We did not discuss the case. My purpose of contacting Ms. Andrews on essentially a twice-weekly basis since that time. Purpose of my contacting Ms. Andrews was to get information from her relative to her involvement in psychotherapy since my evaluation in 2000 on November 9.
So that then you, when you come into court today, you have very updated information.
I have all the available records up until the beginning of this week.
Okay. When you did, are there any of the psychological testings that you think are important to talk about today and you'd like to particularly highlight?
I think there are some tests that are important to highlight, and because there was a significant amount of testing done, and the court is certainly familiar with the numerous reports and psychological testing that have been offered. I think that I won't go through all of that information, of course, but I think there is some information that may be beneficial.
Okay.
And I'll start with the personality assessment inventory, and if you have the report, this is described on page 9 of my report. I should say that the personality assessment inventory for adolescents is a standardized personality assessment, and in terms of the appropriateness for this being offered in court, this does meet the Daubert standard, and is a very well researched personality inventory specifically developed for the use of adolescents. There's also an adult form. This instrument was administered by Dr. DeVille at Winnebago in June of 2016. I re-administered this report during my at the time of my present evaluation in November 2017. And so the benefit of having these two instruments to compare is to help in my decision-making relative to this matter, to determine her level of psychopathology. And one of the things that I think is important here is that Morgan is diagnosed with schizophrenia. This is a major mental illness, and we can expect that this is essentially an illness that will last across her lifespan. The issue is whether this is effectively treated and the symptoms are ameliorated or put in remission through the use of treatment, or whether her symptoms are active. And so the critical issue here is in terms of looking at these two personality inventories, is to look at a time when in fact her symptoms were essentially more active. And let me go back. Okay, so I should say that the first time this instrument was attempted to be administered was in October 2014. Morgan generated an invalid profile at that time, and consequently that is not an interpretable profile. Another evaluation was completed by a psychologist at her responses in this matter were interpretable, and this was considered a valid instrument. It's important to recognize that these instruments have validity scales. We can tell if people are trying to exaggerate or minimize their symptoms. If that's the case, the instruments are either considered not valid, or certainly if they're interpretable, that issue would be an important aspect to delineate. There were not indications of exaggeration or minimization on the PAI that Dr. DeVille offered, nor during my evaluation in November 2017. When we look at the comparisons of these two personality assessment inventories, in 2016, and I'm going to read from my report now, which is available on the screen, I believe, as well. It's particularly informative that the schizophrenia scale, which is indicative not only of psychotic experience but also social detachment, disorganized thinking, was extremely elevated. This is in Dr. DeVille's examination or interpretation of the PAI. In my in Morgan's responses on the PAI that I gave in November 2017, and I'm again reading from my report. In my examination in 2017, the schizophrenia scale was not elevated. It was in a non-pathological range. There were not indications at this time that of my testing that Morgan was experiencing thought disorganization or psychotic thinking. The interpretation of this goes on to indicate that in 2016, Morgan was experiencing depression, anxiety, and these scales were prominently elevated.
So it's a 15-month difference between those two evals or two testings?
Yes.
Why would there be such an improvement in 15 months?
Well, I think that it's relatively clear when we look at the treatment over time that there was a point in time when Dr. Patel, who was Dr. Sangeeta Patel, who was Morgan's primary treating psychiatrist at Winnebago over the course of her care, Dr. Patel was very diligent in adjusting medications and trying to get a good medication combination that would diminish Morgan's symptoms. And in fact, Morgan was started on this antipsychotic medication, Haldol, in I believe it was May of 2017. She'd been tried on numerous other medications that, as I indicated in my report, were not particularly beneficial in diminishing her psychotic symptoms. She continued to have hallucinations, and both auditory and visual. When she was started on the Haldol, this is very clear in the record, this substantially diminished her psychotic symptomatology. And that would be the difference in the two responses on the psychological testing.
So when you did your testing on her and you did your interpretation of the testing, I can see at the bottom of page 9 on your report that you indicate that it was interpretable and without attempts to exaggerate or minimize her psychiatric symptoms. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so she was being truthful and honest.
Yes.
While she took it. And you further state that there's no ongoing acute psychopathology.
That's correct.
And no indication of a psychotic process.
Correct.
Or significant anxiety or depression.
That's correct.
Okay, so in other words, what? She's not seeing or hearing things?
At the time of my examination, Morgan indicated that her visual hallucinations had very substantially diminished. She indicated that she still has some periodic visual anomalies which involve seeing some colors. This is a remarkable reduction in her presentation as compared to having such intrusive visual hallucinations that she essentially was not able to read. Her visual hallucinations were extremely intrusive. And so, although they weren't absolutely gone, they were markedly diminished. I think another important aspect of this is that Morgan realized that this was a symptom of her illness. And likewise, her auditory hallucinations, hearing voices, essentially the same phenomena. There was a period of time when her auditory hallucinations were essentially gone. I should mention that in the record that I reviewed over the past week, Morgan indicated that she experienced some sense of loss, and this is not uncommon in individuals with this type of psychiatric illness, as a result of having no auditory hallucinations, because there is a quality in this psychiatric symptom that may at times be somewhat comforting. And so I think it's informative to recognize that she demonstrates an understanding that the medications have resulted in the reduction and essentially elimination of her auditory hallucinations, and she has insight into the fact that this is a change in her presentation, and while she recognizes that she experiences some kind of sense of loss from this, she also recognizes the importance of maintaining her stability without psychotic symptoms.
And that's important for making decisions about whether she's can safely be released to a lesser restrictive setting, true?
That's correct.
Okay. Going on with your testing, you ran some intellectual testing as well, is that right?
Yes, I did.
And can you give us just a conclusion on how Morgan did on the intellectual testing?
Yes. Morgan has been assessed with the intellectual testing, the Wexler Intelligence Scale for Children, 4th edition, on a few occasions. Morgan's intellectual ability is in the superior range of functioning. In October 2014, she generated a verbal comprehension index score of 142. The mean or average for, on this IQ test, as it is on all IQ testing, is 100. The score places her at the 99.7th percentile, which means she will score better than 99.7 same-aged individuals on intellectual testing, on verbal comprehension. Likewise, her working memory was 120, which places her at the 91st percentile, again, placing her in the superior range of intellectual ability. Perceptual reasoning was 115, placing her at the 84th percentile, and her processing speed was 109. This results in a full-scale IQ of 129, which places her in the 97th percentile.
Well, she's a smart girl.
Yes, she is. I would like to go on and just briefly discuss the issue of my testing at this time in November 2017. And I administered the one subscale from working memory. Working memory has two subscales to arrive at the score. I think it's very informative that at the time of my testing, her her score on digit span, which is one of the two scales, is extrapolated to a score of 72. This is very substantially different and compromised as compared to her working memory score previously, which I believe was 129. And I talk about this in my report, and I think that there were a variety of factors that may have contributed to this. So what this test assesses is the ability for sustained attention and concentration, and the ability to hold and manipulate information briefly. During my examination, let me say it this way. First of all, we know that the use of antipsychotic medications and psychotropic medications has the potential to compromise some intellectual functioning. That may be one of the factors that contributed to this. We also know that chronic mental illness, what we call this a downward drift of intellectual ability with people with mental illness. We expect over periods of time that their cognitive astuteness diminishes. Morgan has not had the length of period of time of either treatment or experiencing this psychiatric disorder that you would expect a very significant reduction in her cognitive capacity. The use of psychotropic medication certainly has a slowing effect on people's cognitive functioning and processing information. This may have attributed to her poor score at this time too. At the time that I did this testing, it was at the end of the day, and at the end of my interview, there was possibly a fatigue factor. Nonetheless, the recommendation that I would make relative to this is that she should be retested again relative to this issue. I think this was an artifact of a variety of issues, and it's probably not particularly informative regarding her ability for working memory.
Okay. Now, speaking of your time that you spent with her, was she cooperative during your interviews with her?
Yes, she was.
Did she sit through the entirety of the interview?
Yes, as indicated, my interviews were approximately 3 hours in total. The first time, I believe I saw her for a bit over an hour, and the second time for 2 hours. She was cooperative, engaged in the interview process. Certainly, she demonstrated some emotional variability, which I believe was appropriate to the content of what we were discussing. She cried periodically during the interviews, and I believe that her tearfulness was also appropriate and somewhat informative, actually. She cried when she talked about the index offense. She expressed sadness and guilt relative to the index offense. She cried when she talked about her lack of opportunities to have an ongoing relationship with her family or peers. And she cried relative to her expectation of spending her life, in her words, incarcerated. And so all of this emotional content, I think, was appropriate to context, and important in that part of the resolution or of a psychiatric illness is the ability to adequately modulate emotion and be able to express emotions in an appropriate way without being labile or aggressive. And I think that this, in my opinion, her tearfulness during my interviews was important because it was appropriate and demonstrated a much better ability to adequately modulate her emotional content than I think was indicated historically.
You mentioned that you talked to Ms. Andrews this week about Morgan just to get an update on her condition, right?
That's correct.
Do you think that, let me ask you, step back from that. Why talk to Jessica Andrews? Why is she an important person in your mind to talk to?
Ms. Andrews has been involved with Morgan essentially since the day that she arrived at the Institute. Ms. Andrews was the social worker on the Petersick unit where Morgan was admitted. She began doing individual psychotherapy with her. Essentially, she did the initial what they're called at the Institute, social services database. So that's an interview and a collection of information. Ms. Andrews then was involved as Morgan's primary individual psychotherapist and saw her on a twice-weekly basis, essentially throughout the time that she's been at the Institute. Ms. Andrews probably, in my opinion, has the best knowledge base about Morgan's progress over time, and has the information that was important to me relative to what's been going on in the past few months since I saw her in November. And so that was the rationale for me to talk to Ms. Andrews. Essentially, was to get an update. I had also talked to Ms. Andrews at the time that I evaluated Morgan. I believe on the November 9th date. I'm not exactly sure, but on one of the two times that I saw Morgan, I also spoke with Ms. Andrews.
Okay. Now, how has Morgan done during her time at Winnebago, which is over 2 years now, isn't it?
Yes, Morgan has actually been at Winnebago in total for 2 years and 2 months. She was in the other year or year and a half or whatever, she was at the Washington County Juvenile Detention. I think that I've tried to offer information in my report that gives a clear kind of history of her treatment at Winnebago.
Can you highlight some of it for us?
Sure. And again, the primary treating psychiatrist has been Dr. Patel. And so my report kind of goes through notes offered by Dr. Patel and other psychiatrists in terms of their view of Morgan over the course of her care. And I should also say that when Morgan was initially admitted to Winnebago, which was in August of 2014, this admission was for to assess her competency to stand trial. And she was evaluated at that time by and these were court-ordered evaluators. These were not people at Winnebago. Dr. Ken Robbins, who's a psychiatrist, and Dr. Brooke Lumbaum, who's a psychologist. And I think it's informative that in both of their evaluations, which were made available to me at the time that I did the NGI evaluation, both of them described Morgan as having a very severe psychotic presentation at that time, auditory and visual hallucinations, and very importantly, a very fixed delusional idea. And one of the things we understand about psychopathology is that the combination of hallucinations and delusions are, when we talk about risk issues and people that are at risk or present risks, the people that have delusions and hallucinations are a greater risk than people that have either hallucinations or delusions. And so when Morgan came in, she had very significant fixed delusional ideas, and she was experiencing hallucinations.
So did she get treated with medication right away? Is that how
Well,
it begins?
actually, she came into the Institute in August of 2014. Medications were ultimately court-ordered in December. I'm sorry, she came into the Institute in August 2014. I'm not sure if I said 15. Medications were court-ordered as a result of a civil commitment that was involved in this case in December 2015. Morgan had been in the Washington County Juvenile Detention Center and had been refusing medications, and she continued to have very significant psychiatric symptoms. When the court ordered medications, which means, of course, she's compelled to take medications by the court order, she was then amenable to taking meds. She did not refuse medications after they were court ordered. And the course is quite clear over the treatment since that time. I should say that Dr. Patel, the treating psychiatrist in August 2014, described Morgan as having a severe psychosis with bizarre thinking. And so Morgan had been tried over the course of her treatment on a variety of medications. In Dr. Patel's note of March 2017, she indicates that she had been on the antipsychotic medication Seroquel and Invega. In fact, Morgan had indicated that these medications, she did not believe that they were particularly beneficial. She continued to have hallucinations. The delusional content was greatly diminished at that time. Dr. Patel then changed her medications, ultimately discontinuing the Seroquel and the Invega, and started her on the antipsychotic medication Haldol, which she continues to be on at this time.
How does Haldol work for Morgan?
Haldol has been a very beneficial medication for Morgan. The medication dose has been systematically increased over time. This has resulted in essentially reduction or elimination of both auditory and visual hallucinations and delusional content. Concomitantly with the lack of symptoms has been a very important increase in Morgan's understanding of her illness, which is a critical factor certainly in my decision making in all cases relative to an individual consideration for less restrictive settings.
So does she have that insight now?
Yes, she does. She recognizes that she has a severe mental illness. She recognizes that without medications, there's a high risk that she would again have symptoms, and these symptoms would result in potentially very negative ramifications.
And to your knowledge, during this time that she's been on these meds, she's always taken them?
Yes, she has. There's no indication in the record at Winnebago that she's had medication refusals.
You indicated also in talking about Morgan's adjustment at Winnebago that there was a note at the bottom of page 15. You talk about a note from February 4th, 2017 from a doctor about Morgan's insight and judgment.
This is at the bottom of page 15, February 4, 2017. This is Dr. Kay Zwicker, who is a psychiatrist at Winnebago. Actually, Dr. Patel, I believe, was out of the institute on vacation, and Dr. Zwicker and Dr. Casimir were covering. Dr. Zwicker indicated that Morgan insight, but I'm sorry, I have to find this in my note here.
I guess the point is that already in February 4th of a year ago, we were seeing some significant insight by Morgan
Yes.
into her situation, right?
Right.
Her mental illness and her need for treatment,
Yes.
right?
Yes, Dr. Zwicker indicates that her hallucinations had greatly diminished, and Morgan's mood has improved, and she has gained insight into her illness. And then she went on, I think, interestingly, Dr. Zwicker, to state more existential issues dealing with the crime she has committed and her emotions about harming her friend. She also seems to have a lot of regret for her own life now.
So while Morgan is in the hospital and the doctors are working on her medication, she's also having psychotherapy, right, with Miss Andrews or other people?
Yes, with Miss Andrews.
With Miss Andrews, okay. And you noted that on the bottom of page 17 that in the past year and a half, Morgan has been quite forthcoming with Miss Andrews about reporting any of her psychiatric symptoms.
Yes, she has. And I think
And that also shows insight, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And I think it's not only with Ms. Andrews, but Dr. Patel's record is also informative relative to Morgan saying these medications aren't working at times and asking for her medications to be reviewed and adjusted. I think this demonstrates a level of insight that's very important in terms of her care.
So at this point in time, do you have a recommendation for this court?
I do. And as I've indicated in my report, I believe that Morgan is appropriate for consideration for a less restrictive setting than inpatient psychiatric care.
Such as what?
I believe residential treatment would be the optimal next step down. And I think that there's a variety of complicating issues here, and I'm talking about now complicating for me in my decision-making relative to this matter. Morgan came into the Institute when she was 12 years old. She's now 15 and a half. And there are very critical developmental issues for children in this age range, from anywhere, we're talking 12 to age majority.
Such as what? What kind of issues?
Well, we recognize there are critical developmental issues in terms of neurocognitive pathways, the development of the issues related to understanding interpersonal relationships, the development of issues related to executive functioning, reduction of impulse control. These are all issues that are very critical in the developmental process for teenagers. And consequently, given the nature of the crime and that Morgan has been in an adult forensic setting since age 12 with adult women, she has not had exposure to adolescents. She's not had the opportunity for any kind of specialized treatment for the treatment of adolescents. I think that at this point, and so that was one of my considerations. It would be beneficial in terms of her developmental process to be in a facility that is dedicated to the treatment of adolescents and where she is with adolescents to develop the capacity for interpersonal social relationships at an appropriate peer level. Another consideration in my decision making was to assess essentially the risk factors, which are critical and of course one of the if not the primary consideration for the court in this matter. And I utilized as kind of a directive in this matter the instrument, the HCR 20. This is normed on adults, and so it was not appropriate to score this for Morgan. However, what it does offer is it offers an understanding of what the risk factors are for recidivism of violence for individuals who have a mental illness.
Can you go through some of those?
I can. One of the risk factors is a major mental illness, and so Morgan has a major mental illness. This is a risk factor, and this increases her risk of dangerousness. Another risk factor is negative attitudes, it's described as. And when I conceptualize this for Morgan, there is some variability in her attitudinal presentation. Morgan has recently been reluctant to go to school. This would be considered a negative attitude. Her reluctance to go to school, I think, is based on her sense of kind of being deflated where she's at and having reduced hope for the future. This has resulted in some of her, I think, difficulties in wanting to engage in school.
But wait, I want to stop you for a minute. Go to school. There's no school at Winnebago.
Yes, they have a school that they offer to for the adolescent population. There are adolescent units.
Ms. Andrews told us that all Morgan is entitled to is a one-on-one education with a private person, approximately 2.5 hours a week.
That's correct.
That's all she gets.
That's right.
Okay.
And so when we assess the negative attitude, there's not negative attitudes towards treatment. There have not been negative attitudes related to her interpersonal relationships with staff or other patients.
Okay.
One of the critical risk factors in recidivism is a person's level of insight into their illness. This, in my opinion, does not present a risk factor at this time, as Morgan has insight into her mental illness, and she has insight and understanding into her need for continued treatment and medications. Another risk factor is if a person has active psychiatric symptoms, and these would include, for example, what I've described, hallucinations, and again, delusional ideas. Morgan does not have active symptoms of her mental illness at this time. These symptoms are in remission as a result of her treatment. Impulsivity is a style of functioning that increases risk factors. There are two things in my evaluation of Morgan that I think are important relative to assessing her impulsivity. There's no indications throughout her entire record and stay at Winnebago that she's ever acted out aggressively. She's never threatened anyone. She's never been in a physical confrontation or essentially a verbal confrontation with staff or patients. She has had one, I'm not sure what it's called, hold during her treatment, which meant that she was made to go to her room. She wasn't in restraints, she wasn't in seclusion. This was for sticking up for another patient. And I believe she had one recently because she was running in the hallway and she was verbally reprimanded. Beyond that, there have been no indications of impulsive, aggressive, inappropriate behavior. The other issue relative to impulsivity is based on psychological testing, Wisconsin card sorting test, which has been given by myself on 2 occasions, and I think Dr. DeVille's evaluation. She also used Wisconsin card sort. This is a test of executive functioning and offers insight into an individual's ability for deductive reasoning. It also demonstrates impulsivity in a person's response set. On this measure, on all times that it was administered, Morgan again scored in the superior range on this test, and there were not indications of an impulsive response set. I don't believe there's adequate information to demonstrate that she is impulsive. Another risk factor is if an individual is not responsive to treatment. We clearly know that she's been responsive to treatment. The next area to consider relative to a person's risk factors are what are called destabilizing factors. Destabilizing factors for Morgan would be stopping medications, not receiving adequate treatment, and being in very high stress situations. These are not expected to occur. She continues to be under an order to treat at the present time. And I certainly would believe that this is an appropriate approach with Morgan to ensure that she will continue to take medications, even though she's not made any indication that she would not. Another risk factor is if a person does not have adequate support. I think the support is adequate, both from her family and from the institutional care. And if she's in a less restrictive setting, certainly this would have a high level of support. Non-compliance with treatment is a risk factor. This has not been an issue. And high levels of stress is a risk factor. And I think her stress, certainly she experiences periodic stress, but I would not consider her stress level exceedingly high.
Okay, so other than her having a major mental illness, she scores well on, and basically she doesn't have the other risk factors.
That's correct.
Okay. And I think you said previously you don't see any signs of her being dangerous, right?
It's my opinion, and of course this is a critical opinion relative to the statutory requirements.
What's your opinion?
It's my opinion that she does not present a risk of danger to self or others or property. And
your final conclusion, if you have one?
Well, my final conclusion is, according to statute, that she does not present a substantial probability of risk of danger to self or others. Along with that, of course, is that she continues to need treatment. And I believe that because of her lack of dangerousness, that she is appropriate for consideration for a less restrictive setting. And my recommendation, I indicated in my report, I indicate that the consideration of Genesee Lake School or a similar facility. After I prepared my report, I did have further contact with Genesee Lake School. She would not be appropriate for that facility, even though they did indicate they would interview her and evaluate her for admission. This facility is primarily dedicated to the treatment of adolescents with neurological disorders or compromised cognitive capacity. They do take some adolescents with psychiatric illness, but it's very few, and they, in all probability, would not accept her. However, this is a residential treatment facility, and I believe a residential treatment facility that's dedicated to the treatment of adolescents with a major mental illness would be the most appropriate and kind of the next step down from where she's at. For example, Genesee Lake School is a monitored egress. It's not, the doors aren't locked, but alarms go off if the kids leave, and the egress is always in visual range of staff. So consideration of a facility that has monitored egress or possibly locked, but is residential care as opposed to the license that the hospitals have would be the next step down, and that would be my recommendation.
Is there any other benefit or that Morgan can receive from Winnebago?
I believe she's achieved maximum benefit from Winnebago, and again, part of my decision making relative to, as I describe it, the step down to residential care is that she would be with adolescents. and she would be treated in an adolescent facility that is dedicated to not only the treatment of her psychiatric illness, but also takes into consideration the developmental considerations and concerns for adolescents.
Because if she remains at Winnebago, she'll remain with adult women, is that right?
Yes, she will.
And she needs to be around adolescents her age,
That would be my opinion, yes.
and in an educational program.
Yes.
And Winnebago's not the place for her at this time.
That would be my opinion, yes.
You give these opinions to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty, Doctor?
Psychological certainty, yes, I do.
Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Cross-examination.
Thank you. Doctor, I was a little confused. I thought at one point during your testimony you said you spent roughly an hour with Morgan the first time and 2 hours the second time.
Yes.
But in the very beginning of your testimony you said you spent 3 hours with her each time.
I said I spent 3 hours with her. If I said each time, that was erroneous. I spent
so it's
3
about-
hours total.
Okay. I didn't know if I heard that wrong or... I want to ask you some questions about something Morgan told you when you interviewed her back in 2016 for the NGI evaluation. You incorporated a lot of that into this report, correct?
I did incorporate aspects from my, I believe, the history, some of the history, yes.
And on page 5 of your report at the top, Morgan had told you that she developed a strategy to convince Anissa that Slender Man was real, and that she engaged in behavior in order to ensure Anissa would help her in Morgan's endeavor to locate Slender Man and prove that he was real. Is that what she told you?
Yes, it is.
She went on to state that she fabricated evidence so Anissa would believe Slender was real, including a fake journal, and she had cut herself and wrote in blood. It made Anissa basically believe they could go find him, right? That's what she told you?
Correct.
Did she ever say anything to you about that she actually felt that it was Anissa that took advantage of Morgan's mental health difficulties?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, did Morgan ever tell you that she believed Anissa took advantage of Morgan's mental health difficulties?
No.
In fact, she somewhat told you that basically it was Morgan who was driving the show and convincing Anissa to go along with her, right?
Correct.
One of the other things she told you, this is on page 6 of your report, was that Morgan indicated she had attempted to discuss some of her psychological difficulties with her mother. Right? She told you that?
Yes.
And what she said was that her mom told her, I'm not interested in these issues. If you continue to bring them up, you're going to be punished. Morgan told you that's how her mother reacted, correct?
Correct.
You interviewed Angie Geyser, right?
I did not.
You did not?
No, I did not. There was very significant interviews available for my review from other evaluators, and I elected not to interview her mother.
Okay, but you're aware of some of the things she had said to other interviewers, right?
Yes.
And she had consistently told other interviewers they had no idea that Morgan was having any mental health difficulties, right?
That's correct.
You never interviewed Angie about Morgan's claim that Angie said she'd be punished if she brought up mental health difficulties.
I did not.
And everything you know from all of the records you've reviewed is that Angie Geyser's been nothing but appropriate in terms of trying to get Morgan the best care she could get, right?
I don't have a lot of information about that. I mean, certainly from the records, I don't see anything negative in that relationship. I know that she visits Morgan, but I'm not aware of kind of her, what she's done in terms of trying to get treatment, et cetera.
So there really wasn't any attempt to try to assess the truthfulness of what Morgan had said about, my mom said she'd punish me if I brought up mental health difficulties.
Well, first of all, we're talking about something that's already been adjudicated, that Morgan has been found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. And as part of my examination of Morgan, as I do in all my NGI evaluations, I did consider and assess whether she was malingering. It's a very important issue for me and for all forensic evaluators, of course. And my decision was that she was not malingering. And obviously that ultimately apparently prevailed in terms of the ultimate decision in this matter.
Well, I'm just talking about this very specific narrow issue about whether or not her mother told her she'd be punished if she brought up mental health issues again.
That's what she told me.
You testified also about Morgan has experienced some sense of loss as a result of the diminished hallucinations, correct?
Correct.
And I believe it may have been Dr. Casimir, but at some point during all of this, Morgan had expressed a concern about taking medications because she didn't want to lose her friends.
Correct.
You reviewed that somewhere in all these records.
Yes, I did.
And we know, at least to some extent, there's been some sadness and depression over the last 5 or so months, correct?
Correct.
And do you believe any of that can be related to this sense of loss you've described?
I think that's an important issue to clarify in terms of the etiology of her present depression. There are a whole variety of things going on with Morgan that may have the potential to result in a reduction in her mood. And that's one of them. And this is not an uncommon phenomena for people that have hallucinations when they take medications, that this is an experience of, especially if these hallucinations are positive. And certainly some hallucinations for people, you know, they hear voices that say positive things about them. And if people are isolated, this is another issue, that this is a level of stimulation that's not available otherwise. And so this is not an uncommon phenomenon.
Doctor, if you had heard that perhaps there had been some auditory hallucinations in the month of October, would that at all change your evaluation of Morgan's current situation?
No, I think that that's important and informative, actually, because what we know is that her hallucinations have substantially diminished, and because she is willing to say that out loud, that's an important issue. If she's withholding that information, that's very concerning. But when she's expressing this, it results in her ability to be more effectively treated by her treating psychiatrist. They can adjust her medications. They can this can be addressed in psychotherapy. And so I think that it's not uncommon for people that have schizophrenia to have breakthrough symptoms. I mean, that's part of the illness. And you can't expect that a person that has a schizophrenic disorder will be in remission with medications and never have some type of breakthrough symptoms. The important thing is that they're willing to talk about that and receive treatment before they decompensate. And just because a person has breakthrough symptoms does not mean that they will subsequently more substantially decompensate. They may, but it's not necessarily going to happen. But the ability to talk about that and essentially demonstrates insight into the illness, and then the person is more available to be effectively treated.
During the digit span testing that you conducted, or I guess I should say right after that, Doctor, it's true that Morgan became anxious and frustrated because she had done poorly, and she requested that you not proceed with any other psychological testing, correct?
That's correct.
I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any redirect?
Just briefly. So when you had your visits with Morgan, she was, at that point in time, not symptomatic, right?
That's correct.
And she had a good memory.
Yes.
She had, and still does, as far as you understand or believe, have good insight into her psychiatric illness.
Correct.
She has good insight into the benefits of medication.
Yes.
She takes them.
Yes, she does.
She told you that she believes that she needs those medications and will continue to take them even if there wasn't a court order.
Yes, she did.
But there is a court order.
Yes, there is.
She explained to you that if she wasn't treated, she would decompensate potentially.
That's correct.
And she probably would, right?
That's certainly a very significant risk, yes.
It was your opinion that her judgment was substantially improved.
Correct.
And you also discussed with her her treatment needs, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And she told you she'd like to go home to her family.
She did.
But she told you that it would, in her mind, be unlikely to happen at this time, right?
Yes, she did.
And that seems to be quite insightful.
I think that's a realistic view of where she's at, yes.
It's realistic. And that if she was able to go to a less restrictive setting than inpatient, such as a transitional living situation, it'd be appropriate. She felt that way.
That's what she said, yes.
At 15 years old, she understood that.
Yes.
And that's in fact what you are recommending today, some sort of less restrictive than Winnebago, some sort of residential treatment facility.
Correct.
It's appropriate for Morgan at this time.
Yes.
And you're not recommending a specific facility, right?
No, I'm not.
And in fact, the court doesn't even order a specific facility, right?
The court requested a review of available facilities, and the State Department of Health Services has the responsibility to provide that.
And they do that over the course of 20 days or 40 days or something like that, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And then the judge would also, once they make a recommendation or offer the available options, then the judge would sign off on that.
Not necessarily.
Or he could.
He could, yes.
And he could say
certainly.
no.
Certainly. The judge has the responsibility to make the final decision relative to that placement.
But this is an agency that is experienced at looking at all the available, possible available facilities and making recommendations.
The state, I believe, is divided into 4 areas, each having, I'm not sure if it's 3 or 4, each having a conditional release coordinator and team. And the conditional release coordinator makes the ultimate, develops a plan, it makes the ultimate recommendation and offers that to the court. And so that's what the conditional release, the responsibility of the state agency of the conditional release, that's what they do. That's all they do.
Thank you, Doctor. That's all, Judge.
Thank you. Then Attorney Zupakowicz, anything further?
Yes, Doctor, you, on page 19 of your report under treatment recommendations, you have some very specific things that you recommend, but indicate that if those recommendations or similar recommendations are not able to be implemented, then you are not in support of conditional release.
That's correct. And I'll be more specific about why I make that statement in my report is unfortunately, I've been involved in hundreds of conditional releases where treatment plans have not been adequately developed and people have not been successful in the community as a result of that. And so I think it's very important that when people leave the institutes that they have the appropriate and adequate treatment for their well-being as well as the well-being of the community. Clearly, if people aren't adequately treated, this presents a risk to the community as well.
So if those that are, I guess, tasked with helping to set up this plan don't believe conditional release is appropriate, that may change your opinion as to whether or not conditional release is appropriate. Is that true?
No. It's not whether conditional release is appropriate. These are recommendations that are able to be accomplished. These are not, recommendations that are out of line, that a person is set up to see a psychiatrist as opposed to a nurse practitioner, for example, within 2 weeks of their discharge, that they're set up to see a psychotherapist, that they have opportunities for other, I suggest, mindfulness, stress reduction training. These are all things that are available within the mental health system. These aren't, ridiculous or pie in the sky recommendations. So it's not that I would not recommend the conditional release. I'm recommending a less restrictive setting. If these conditions aren't met, then I believe the state and the trier of fact have a decision point.
Well, the issue for the court is not a least restrictive setting, it's institutional care or conditional release, correct?
It is, but the trier of fact also has the responsibility to determine if the treatment plan for conditional release is appropriate.
I understand, but there first has to be the decision
Certainly.
that the person should be conditionally released.
Sure, of course. And that's not my decision, of course.
That's all, thank you.
Any further direct?
No, that's on paper.
All right, thank you. Is Dr. Berney under subpoena?
No.
All right. Well, thank you for being here, Doctor.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Good day.
Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Further witnesses, Mr. Cotton?
No, Your Honor. Ask for a short recess if we could.
Yeah, we'll take one, but just wanted to know what stage we're at. So there'd be no further witnesses from Ms. Geyser's team. Any further witnesses from the state, Mr. Sepekowitz?
No.
All right. So when we come back, we'll take about a 10-minute recess. When we come back, I'd look for arguments from the state and then from Ms. Geyser. So we'll take a 10-minute recess.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.